A day that should have been ordinary. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Westridge, a small suburban neighborhood tucked away from the bustling city. Birds chirped softly, and the early morning air was crisp and inviting. For Jason Ellis, a 17-year-old African-American boy with a bright future ahead of him, it seemed like any other day, a calm, unremarkable morning filled with the usual routine. But little did he know, this day would take an unexpected turn that would not only change his life, but leave an indelible mark on the community he called home. Jason was a thoughtful young man, always conscientious and deeply attached to his family. His mother, a nurse who worked long hours, had instilled in him the value of hard work and the importance of family. His father, a high school teacher, had nurtured Jason's curiosity and love for learning. But the person who held a special place in Jason's heart was his grandmother, Ellen, a white woman with silver hair and soft blue eyes that sparkled with warmth. She had raised Jason's mother and was always there for Jason, offering wisdom, laughter, and an endless supply of affection. Jason adored his grandmother. Despite their differences in skin color, they shared a deep bond forged through years of love, care, and understanding. Ellen had never let society's prejudices seep into their family, and Jason grew up feeling proud of who he was. They had their rituals, visiting the local farmers market, playing card games on lazy Sunday afternoons, and most notably, their weekly drives. Jason would take the wheel of his grandmother's old, but well-maintained sedan, a maroon-colored Buick Regal, and they would cruise through the scenic countryside together, talking about everything from school to life's mysteries. Today was one of those days. Jason, having recently earned his driver's license, felt an exhilarating sense of freedom every time he got behind the wheel. He couldn't wait to spend the afternoon driving his grandmother to a nearby town to check out an antique fair she had been raving about for weeks. Helen loved collecting old furniture and vintage items, a hobby she'd indulged in since her husband's passing many years ago. Jason, although not particularly interested in antiques, enjoyed their time together. He loved hearing her stories and getting lost in her world for a while. As Jason finished getting ready, he heard the familiar sound of his grandmother's car pulling into the driveway. He grabbed his jacket and hurried out the front door, greeting her with a smile that was met with an equally warm embrace. "Ready for our adventure?" Ellen asked, her voice light with excitement. "You know it," Jason replied, opening the car door for her like the gentleman his father had raised him to be. They set off, Jason carefully maneuvering the car through the quiet streets of their neighborhood, both of them basking in the pleasant hum of the engine and the warmth of the afternoon sun. As they headed out onto the main highway, Jason and Ellen began chatting, falling into the easy rhythm of conversation that was a hallmark of their time together. They laughed about old stories, shared thoughts about Jason's future, and even debated which route was quicker to their destination. Everything felt perfect, peaceful, normal. But as they approached the outskirts of the neighboring town, the peacefulness began to slip away. Jason noticed a police car trailing them in his rearview mirror. At first, he didn't think much of it. Just a routine patrol, he assumed. But then the sirens blared, and the flashing lights illuminated the interior of their car. Jason's stomach dropped. He was confused. Had he done something wrong? He knew he was driving carefully, obeying the speed limit, and signaling properly. What could possibly be the reason for them getting pulled over? "Just stay calm," his grandmother said, sensing his tension. "We haven't done anything wrong." Jason nodded, pulling over to the side of the road. He took a deep breath, his heart beginning to race. As the officer approached, Jason lowered the window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, just like his father had taught him in case he ever got stopped by the police. The officer, a tall man with a stern face, peered into the car, his gaze landing on Jason first before shifting to Ellen. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his voice devoid of warmth. Jason complied, handing over his license and the registration from the glove compartment. His hands trembled slightly as he did, but he kept his composure. Ellen, sensing the tension, offered the officer a polite smile, hoping to diffuse the situation. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm. The officer ignored her question, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jason's license. After a long pause, he glanced back at Jason, his expression hardening. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Jason blinked in surprise, his heart now thudding in his chest. "Why? What did I do?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion and fear. "Step out of the car," the officer repeated, this time with more force. Jason glanced at his grandmother, who looked equally bewildered. Her face had lost some of its color, and she reached out to touch Jason's arm, as if to offer reassurance. "Officer, there must be some kind of misunderstanding," Ellen began, but the officer cut her off. "Ma'am, I need you to stay quiet for a moment." Jason unbuckled his seatbelt and slowly stepped out of the car, his heart hammering in his chest. The officer immediately grabbed Jason by the arm, roughly pulling him away from the vehicle. Ellen's protests grew louder, but she was ignored. "What are you doing?" Jason cried, panic rising in his throat. "You matched the description of a suspect in a robbery that happened nearby," the officer said coldly as he began to cuff Jason's hands behind his back. "What? No, that can't be." Jason's voice broke, his mind racing. He had been with his grandmother all day. How could he possibly be a suspect? Ellen got out of the car, her hands trembling as she approached the officer. "Please, there's a mistake. This is my grandson. He hasn't done anything wrong," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Ma'am, step back or I'll arrest you too," the officer snapped, his voice full of authority. The weight of the cuffs on Jason's wrists felt suffocating, and the shock of what was happening overwhelmed him. He couldn't believe this was real. Just minutes ago, he was laughing with his grandmother, enjoying their drive. Now he was being treated like a criminal, his freedom ripped away in an instant. The officer roughly pushed Jason into the back seat of the patrol car, slamming the door shut. Ellen stood frozen, tears welling up in her eyes, powerless to stop what was happening. Jason's mind reeled, trying to make sense of the injustice he was facing. All he could think about was how this could have been prevented, how this never would have happened if he didn't fit the description simply because of the color of his skin. As the patrol car pulled away, Ellen's small figure disappeared in the rearview mirror, and a crushing weight settled on Jason's chest. This was the beginning of a nightmare that neither of them had anticipated, and it was a nightmare that would change their lives, and the lives of many others, forever. Part 1 Summary. Jason, a bright young African-American teenager, enjoys a special bond with his white grandmother, Ellen. They set out for a peaceful drive to an antique fair, but their tranquil day is shattered when Jason is pulled over by the police and wrongfully arrested. What seems like a routine stop quickly escalates into a moment of profound injustice, as Jason is accused of a crime based solely on a vague description. This event marks the beginning of a chain reaction that will impact not only Jason and Ellen, but the entire community. The silent scars of injustice. As the patrol car sped away, Jason sat in the back seat, his heart pounding, hands tightly cuffed behind him. The world outside blurred by, but inside the car, time seemed to slow down. His mind raced, cycling between disbelief and fear. The officer's words rang in his ears. "You matched the description of a suspect." How could this be happening? He had spent the entire day with his grandmother. What description? What suspect? His wrists ached from the cold steel of the handcuffs digging into his skin, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. Jason's thoughts circled around one bitter realization. This was happening because of the way he looked. No matter how much he tried to stay calm, the weight of that truth pressed down on him with a suffocating force. In the front seat, the officer drove in silence, his face impassive, as if this was just another routine arrest. To him, Jason was just another suspect, But to Jason, this was the moment his life was spiraling out of control. Back on the side of the road, Ellen stood in stunned disbelief as she watched the patrol car disappear from sight. The stillness of the road felt unnatural, eerie, in the wake of what had just occurred. She clutched her handbag tightly, her knuckles white, as her mind scrambled to make sense of the situation. How could this have happened? Her grandson, the boy she had practically helped raise, was being treated like a criminal. And for what? The shock that had frozen her in place began to melt away, replaced by an urgent need to act. Ellen had always been a quiet, gentle woman, but the injustice she had just witnessed lit a fire within her. This was not just a misunderstanding. It was something much deeper, much darker. She could see it in the way the officer had looked at Jason, the way he had dismissed her pleas without a second thought. It was a kind of bias she had read about, heard about, but never thought would strike so close to home. With shaky hands, Ellen reached for her phone and dialed Jason's mother, Evelyn. The line rang only once before Evelyn picked up. "Mom, is everything okay? You're calling earlier than I expected," Evelyn said, her voice cheerful, unaware of the storm that was brewing. Ellen's voice trembled as she spoke. "Evelyn, something's happened. The police, they've taken Jason." "What?" Evelyn's voice dropped, heavy with shock. "What do you mean taken him? Where are you?" "We were pulled over, and they arrested him. They said he matched some description, but it's not right. It's not right at all. They wouldn't listen to me," Ellen explained, her words coming out in a rush. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then, after a long pause, Evelyn's voice came through, low and fierce. "I'm coming. Stay where you are." Back in the police car, Jason tried to steady his breathing. His thoughts jumped between fear for himself and concern for his grandmother. He imagined her standing by the side of the road, helpless and scared. The image twisted his heart in knots. The car pulled into the station, and the officer parked, yanking Jason out of the backseat. Jason stumbled, struggling to regain his balance, but the officer's grip was unrelenting. He was led inside, where the harsh fluorescent lights made the cold, sterile environment of the police station feel even more alien. Jason had never been in a police station before. He had never even imagined a place like this. His mind buzzed with questions. What happens next? How long will this take? Why isn't anyone listening to me? The officer marched him to a desk where another officer, a woman with tired eyes, was typing away on a computer. Without looking up, she asked for Jason's name and began processing his information. The clicking of the keyboard seemed to echo in Jason's head, each clack reminding him of how surreal this all was. After being fingerprinted and photographed, Jason was escorted to a holding cell. The metal door clanged shut behind him with a heavy finality. He stood there for a moment, staring at the empty bench in the middle of the small concrete room. It smelled of stale air and disinfectant. The walls seemed to close in on him as he sat down, his legs finally giving way to the exhaustion and fear that had been building inside him. Jason tried to keep his mind steady, but it was impossible. All he could think about was his grandmother, his parents, and the future that now seemed uncertain. Would this go on his record? What would people say? What would his friends think if they knew? And most painfully, how would he explain to himself why this was happening? Hours later, outside the police station, Evelyn and Ellen arrived, breathless from the tense drive over. Evelyn stormed up to the front desk, her expression one of controlled fury. She had always been a strong woman, but this, seeing her son wrongfully taken, had pushed her into a realm of anger she had never experienced before. "I'm here for my son, Jason Ellis," she said, her voice firm and clear. The officer at the desk barely glanced at her. "He's being processed right now." "Processed for what? He hasn't done anything wrong," Evelyn shot back. "You have no right to hold him. He's a child." The officer looked at her then, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Ma'am, please calm down. We're following procedure." "Procedure?" Evelyn's voice cracked with indignation. Your procedure is based on a lie. My son has been with his grandmother all day. You have no reason to hold him. Ellen stepped forward, her hands shaking. It's true. He's been with me the entire time. This is a mistake. Please. The officer's expression didn't change. If your son is innocent, then this will get sorted out. But for now, he's being held for questioning in relation to a robbery. Evelyn's heart raced with fury. She knew this wasn't just about procedure. This was about prejudice, about the way her son had been profiled simply because of his race. She had prepared for moments like this in theory, knowing the realities of raising a black son in America, but to experience it firsthand was something different, something raw and painful. Inside the holding cell, Jason sat with his head in his hands, trying to keep his emotions in check. He had always been taught to stay calm, to be patient in difficult situations, but this was different. The unfairness of it all gnawed at him. How could this happen in a country that claimed to be fair? He thought of all the times he had been told to believe in justice, in the law, in doing the right thing. But right now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the color of his skin and a random, mistaken description that had landed him here. Suddenly, the door clanged open, and the officer who had arrested him stepped inside. You're being released, the officer said flatly. Jason blinked in surprise, the words not fully registering at first. Released? Turns out you weren't the guy we were looking for after all, the officer said, as though it were nothing more than an inconvenience. Your grandmother's been pretty loud about it, so you're free to go. Jason stared at the officer, anger and relief swirling in his chest. He stood up, feeling a sense of disorientation wash over him. Just like that, it was over. As if it had been a small mistake, a minor inconvenience, when in reality it had left a scar on his soul that he wasn't sure would ever heal. When Jason walked out of the station, he saw his mother and grandmother waiting for him, their faces etched with worry and anger. Ellen rushed forward, pulling Jason into a tight hug, her tears soaking into his jacket. Evelyn stood beside them, her eyes burning with quiet rage. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ripples through a small town. The ride home from the police station was quiet, with only the hum of the car engine breaking the tense silence. Jason sat in the back seat, staring out of the window, his hands clenched in his lap. His grandmother, Ellen, was beside him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. In the driver's seat, his mother, Evelyn, gripped the wheel so tightly that her knuckles were pale. No one spoke. Jason's mind replayed the day's events in an endless loop. The officer's harsh voice, the cold handcuffs, the suffocating walls of the holding cell. It felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. What hurt the most wasn't just the arrest, but the way it had all unfolded. How his grandmother's pleas had been ignored, how he had been treated like a criminal from the moment they were stopped, and how none of it made sense. They pulled into the driveway of their home, a modest two-story house with a neatly kept lawn and a basketball hoop Jason used to practice at after school. But today, it didn't feel like home. Everything felt different, tainted by the experience he had just endured. As they walked inside, Evelyn finally broke the silence. Jason, honey, do you want to talk about it? She asked softly, her voice laced with worry. Jason shook his head, unable to find the words. What could he say? That he felt angry, scared? That he didn't understand why this had happened? That none of it made sense? He didn't even fully understand his own emotions yet. His mother didn't push him, but the pain in her eyes told him that she knew exactly how he felt. Ellen placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, her touch warm but trembling. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have done more. I should have stopped them. Jason shook his head again, swallowing the lump in his throat. It's not your fault, Grandma. None of this is your fault. But as he said the words, a part of him couldn't help but wonder whose fault it really was. He knew this was bigger than just a single cop or a bad mistake. This was something systemic, something ingrained in the very fabric of the world he lived in. It was about race, about prejudice, about the way people saw him before they even knew him. Evelyn turned to Ellen, her face hard with determination. "We're not letting this go, Mom. We're going to fight this." Ellen nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." They sat down together in the living room, the weight of the day hanging over them like a heavy fog. Jason's father, Richard, would be home soon, and they would have to explain everything to him. But even as they braced themselves for that conversation, there was a bigger one looming on the horizon, a conversation with the world outside their home. They couldn't keep this to themselves. The community needed to know what had happened, and the police needed to be held accountable. The next morning, news of Jason's wrongful arrest began to spread like wildfire through the town of Westridge. It started with whispers at the grocery store, murmurs at the local diner, and hushed conversations at church. But soon, it exploded onto social media, where posts about the incident began to circulate. Within hours, the story had reached hundreds of people, and outrage began to build. Maplewood and Westridge were neighboring towns with a history of being close-knit, but this incident drew a sharp line through the heart of the community. The fact that a teenager who had grown up in the area, someone known for his kindness and academic excellence, could be so unjustly treated sparked conversations that had long been avoided. At the local high school where Jason was a junior, the news hit even harder. His classmates were shocked and confused. Jason was one of the top students, a star player on the basketball team, and known for his easygoing nature. The idea that someone like him could be arrested without cause shook many of them to their core. During lunch that day, groups of students huddled together in the cafeteria, discussing what had happened. Some of Jason's closest friends, including his best friend, Marcus, were trying to make sense of it all. "They just arrested him for no reason," Marcus asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "That's insane." Another friend, Naomi, shook her head, her eyes wide with anger. "It's not insane. It's racist. They arrested him because he's black, plain and simple." A heavy silence settled over the group. Naomi's words struck a nerve. For some of them, this was the first time they had really confronted the realities of racial profiling. Westridge was a predominantly white town, and while everyone got along on the surface, issues of race were often swept under the rug. "I mean, I always knew this stuff happened," Marcus said quietly. "But it's different when it's your best friend, you know." Naomi nodded. "Exactly. And that's why we can't just let it go. We need to stand with him." As the conversations continued, a sense of urgency began to grow. By the end of the day, students were talking about organizing a protest. The injustice of what had happened to Jason wasn't just something they could ignore. It was a call to action. Meanwhile, at home, Jason sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his textbooks. He had tried to go about his day as normally as possible, but everything felt wrong. The textbooks that used to excite him with possibilities now seemed irrelevant in the face of what he had experienced. His mind kept drifting back to the police station, the coldness in the officer's eyes, the feeling of being powerless. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Marcus. "Marcus, yo man, everyone at school's talking about what happened. We're all with you. They're planning a protest. You okay?" Jason stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. He appreciated the support, but part of him didn't want to be the center of attention. He didn't want to be the kid who got arrested. He just wanted to go back to his normal life, to be Jason Ellis, the teenager who played basketball and did well in school. But deep down, he knew that wasn't possible anymore. Later that evening, as Jason and his parents sat down for dinner, the phone rang. Evelyn answered, her expression quickly turning serious as she spoke into the receiver. After a few moments, she hung up and turned to Jason. "That was Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, referring to the head of the local NAACP chapter. "She heard about what happened, and she wants to meet with us." She thinks we should take this to the next level. Jason frowned. What do you mean? She's talking about legal action, Evelyn explained. And she wants to help organize a protest. Jason's heart skipped a beat. A protest. Legal action. It all felt too big, too overwhelming. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't wanted to become the face of some larger movement. But at the same time, he knew this wasn't just about him. This was about something bigger, something that affected so many people like him. Richard, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. Son, this isn't just about what happened to you. It's about what's happening to a lot of people every day. This kind of thing, it's bigger than just one incident. Jason looked at his father, feeling the weight of his words. He knew his dad was right, but the idea of standing up, of fighting back, was terrifying. What if people didn't believe him? What if they dismissed his experience, or worse, used it against him? I don't know if I'm ready for all of this, Jason admitted, his voice small. Evelyn reached across the table and took his hand. You don't have to do it alone, honey. We're with you, every step of the way. The days that followed were a whirlwind. News of Jason's arrest continued to spread, not just locally, but across the state. People were outraged by the injustice, and it wasn't long before the media caught wind of the story. Reporters started calling, and Jason's family had to make decisions about how to move forward. On the day of the protest, the town square was filled with people. Signs were held high, with messages like "Justice for Jason" and "Stop Racial Profiling" scrawled in bold letters. The air was thick with emotion, anger, frustration, but also hope. This was more than just a protest for Jason. It was a rallying cry for change. Jason stood on the steps of the town hall, his heart pounding as he looked out at the crowd. His parents stood beside him, their presence grounding him, giving him strength. He had never spoken in front of so many people before, and the weight of their expectations sat heavily on his shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Jason stepped forward to the microphone. The crowd quieted, all eyes on him. His hands trembled slightly, but he steadied himself. I didn't ask for any of this, he began, his voice steady but soft. I didn't ask to be arrested, and I didn't ask to become the face of something bigger. But this isn't just about me. This is about every black kid who's ever been judged before they've been known. It's about every person who's been treated differently just because of the color of their skin. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Jason felt a surge of confidence. We shouldn't have to fight for our humanity, but here we are, he continued, and we're not going to stop until things change. Awakening the giant. The protest that filled the town square marked a turning point not just for Jason, but for the entire town of Westridge. The sleepy, suburban streets that had always been a backdrop for block parties, bake sales, and family barbecues were now transformed into a battleground for justice and equality. For the first time in living memory, the community was forced to confront issues that had long been simmering under the surface but were rarely spoken about. After Jason's speech at the rally, the crowd erupted into applause. He had been nervous, his voice shaky at first, but by the end, something had clicked inside him. Speaking out had given him a sense of empowerment he hadn't known he needed. This was about more than just clearing his name. It was about standing up for himself and everyone else who had ever been judged unfairly. And he wasn't alone. The protest lasted several hours, with local leaders, community organizers, and students taking turns speaking out. People held signs, chanted for justice, and marched through the streets, demanding accountability from the police department. The energy was electric, and while the crowd remained peaceful, their determination was palpable. The aftermath of the rally. In the days following the protest, the community's reaction to Jason's arrest continued to grow. Local news stations covered the rally, and Jason's story spread even further through social media. People from nearby towns and even across the state reached out in support, sharing their own experiences with racial profiling and police injustice. But as support for Jason grew, so did the pushback from some corners of Westridge. Not everyone in the town was on board with the protest or the conversations it sparked about race. Some residents felt uncomfortable with the attention the town was receiving, and others dismissed Jason's arrest as an unfortunate misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion. One afternoon, while Jason and his parents were having lunch in the kitchen, the doorbell rang. Evelyn answered it to find their next-door neighbor, Mr. Harris, standing on the porch. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair, a friendly enough guy who had lived next to them for years. But today, his expression was tight with unease. "Evelyn," Mr. Harris began, shifting uncomfortably, "I wanted to talk to you about everything that's been happening." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, sensing the tension in his voice. "Sure, what's on your mind?" Mr. Harris glanced at the ground before looking back up. "Well, I've been hearing a lot about the protest and what happened to Jason. And, I just think maybe it's getting a little out of hand, you know. I mean, we're a quiet town, and this kind of thing, it's bringing in a lot of outside attention. Maybe it's best to let things calm down." Evelyn's eyes hardened as she folded her arms. "Out of hand? Our son was arrested for no reason, and you think we should just let things calm down?" Mr. Harris raised his hands defensively. "I'm not saying what happened wasn't wrong, but this is Westridge. We're not like the big cities where this kind of thing happens all the time. Maybe the police made a mistake, but stirring up all this talk about race, it's just making people uncomfortable." Jason, who had been listening from the kitchen, felt a surge of frustration. He stood up and walked over to the door, his voice steady but firm. "With all due respect, Mr. Harris, people should be uncomfortable. This isn't just about me. This is about something bigger, something that's been happening to people like me for a long time, whether you've noticed it or not." Mr. Harris looked taken aback by Jason's words. "I just don't think." "You don't think this is your problem because it didn't happen to you?" Jason interrupted, his anger rising. "But it could have been anyone. What if I hadn't been with my grandmother? What if something worse had happened? You think it's just going to go away if we stop talking about it?" Evelyn placed a hand on Jason's arm, sensing his anger. Mr. Harris shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. He muttered something about hoping for the best before turning and walking back to his house, leaving Jason and his family standing in the doorway. Evelyn sighed, shaking her head. "This is what we're up against," she said quietly. "People who don't want to see what's right in front of them." Jason felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't just about the police who had arrested him. It was about the entire system, the society that allowed these kinds of things to happen, while people like Mr. Harris looked the other way. A battle for change. Despite the resistance from some parts of the community, the momentum for change continued to build. Jason's family met with Mrs. Rodriguez from the local NAACP chapter, as well as several civil rights lawyers who had taken an interest in the case. The lawyers were adamant. What had happened to Jason was not just a mistake. It was a violation of his rights, and the police department needed to be held accountable. "We can file a civil rights lawsuit against the department," one of the lawyers explained during a meeting at the Ellis family's home. "But this won't just be about monetary compensation. This is about changing the way the police operate in this town." Jason sat quietly, listening as his parents and the lawyers discussed the legal steps they could take. Part of him still felt overwhelmed by everything that was happening, but another part of him was growing more determined. If his arrest could help bring about change, then maybe it had happened for a reason. "I want to do it," Jason said, his voice cutting through the conversation. Evelyn looked at him, her expression softening. "Are you sure, honey? This could be a long fight." Jason nodded. "I'm sure. If this can stop something like this from happening to someone else, then it's worth it." With that decision made, the wheels of justice were set in motion. The lawyers filed a lawsuit against the police department, accusing them of racial profiling and wrongful arrest. The lawsuit quickly gained attention in the media, further elevating Jason's story. Division in the community. As the lawsuit moved forward, tensions in the town grew. For every person who supported Jason and his family, there seemed to be another who was uncomfortable with the attention the town was receiving. The local newspaper ran several articles about the lawsuit, and while many of the comments were supportive, there were also those who expressed frustration and anger. One afternoon, while Jason was walking home from school, he overheard a conversation between two men at the coffee shop on the corner. "Can you believe they're suing the police?" one man said, shaking his head. "I mean, the kid wasn't even hurt. It was just a mistake. Now they're trying to make it into this whole race thing." The other man nodded. "Yeah, it's ridiculous. This town doesn't have a race problem. They're just blowing it all out of proportion." Jason clenched his fists as he walked by, his heart pounding with frustration. These people didn't understand, didn't want to understand. They were blind to the deeper issues at play, to the way his arrest was part of a much larger problem that affected people all over the country. At school, the atmosphere was mixed. Some of Jason's classmates were incredibly supportive, joining in on conversations about racial justice and even organizing a second protest. Others, however, were less enthusiastic. Jason could feel the stares and hear the whispers in the hallways. Some students avoided him altogether, while others made snide comments about him being famous now. One day, during lunch, a student named Tyler approached Jason's table. Tyler was someone Jason had known since middle school, but they had never been particularly close. "Hey, Jason," Tyler said, his voice casual but laced with a hint of sarcasm. "I heard you're suing the cops. Must be nice to get all that attention, huh?" Jason looked up from his sandwich, his expression unreadable. "It's not about attention, Tyler." Tyler shrugged. "Whatever, man. Just seems like you're milking this for all it's worth." Marcus, who was sitting beside Jason, shot Tyler a glare. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about Jason. It's about stopping this kind of thing from happening again." Tyler smirked. "Yeah, well, maybe if Jason wasn't, hanging out with the wrong crowd, he wouldn't have gotten arrested in the first place." The words hit Jason like a punch to the gut. "The wrong crowd," he repeated, his voice low with disbelief. "I was with my grandmother, Tyler. What kind of crowd is that?" Tyler's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Whatever, man. Just seems like you're making a big deal out of nothing." Jason stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been one for confrontation, but this was too much. "It's not nothing. It's my life. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're part of the problem." Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Naomi, who had been sitting quietly until now, stood up and placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. "Let's go, Jason," she said calmly. "He's not worth it." Jason hesitated for a moment before nodding and walking away with Naomi and ChatGPT, he said. ChatGPT. Marcus. As they exited the cafeteria, he felt a mix of anger and disappointment. It was hard to grapple with the fact that not everyone saw the injustice for what it was. The awakening of the community. Despite the backlash, the movement was growing stronger. More and more people began to join in the fight for justice, and the second protest was set to take place in a larger venue, a local park that could accommodate a bigger crowd. Community organizations began to rally around Jason's story, and even some local businesses stepped up to show their support. On the day of the protest, the park was filled with people. Families, students, and community leaders gathered together, united in their desire for change. Signs were raised high, and the atmosphere was charged with hope. Jason stood at the forefront, flanked by his family and friends, feeling a sense of purpose wash over him. As speakers took turns addressing the crowd, Jason could see the impact of their words. People were listening. Conversations were starting. Eyes were opening. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about an awakening, a shift in perspective. When it was Jason's turn to speak, he took a deep breath, feeling the energy of the crowd propelling him forward. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady and strong. This isn't just about what happened to me. This is about all of us, about standing up for what's right and fighting against the injustices that affect our community. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Jason felt a rush of adrenaline. Together, we can make a difference, he continued. We can change how things are done in Westridge and beyond. But it starts with us. It starts with having these difficult conversations, with standing up when we see something wrong, and with refusing to accept the status quo. The crowd responded with shouts of agreement, their energy palpable. Jason felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes as he looked out at the faces of those who had come to support him. People were finally waking up to the truth, and for the first time, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself. The ripple effect. The energy surrounding the protests began to reverberate through Westridge, as families and individuals united in their desire for justice. For Jason, the outpouring of support felt both empowering and surreal. He had always known his community to be a place of warmth and camaraderie, but now it was transforming into a platform for serious discourse on race, injustice, and accountability. The power of connection. In the weeks following the protests, Jason became somewhat of a local celebrity, though he struggled with that title. He preferred the term activist over celebrity, as it felt more aligned with the purpose he had discovered within himself. The media coverage of his story continued to grow, with local and even national news outlets featuring him in articles and interviews. With each story published, Jason felt a mix of pride and anxiety. He was grateful for the attention, yet the weight of representation weighed heavily on his shoulders. At school, discussions surrounding the movement began to emerge in classrooms. Teachers organized forums where students could express their thoughts, feelings, and experiences related to race and social justice. Jason's English teacher, Mrs. Thomas, introduced a project centered on modern activism and civil rights, urging her students to examine the ways in which history repeated itself. "I want you all to think critically about what it means to fight for justice," she said during one class, her voice filled with passion. "Look at the past and see how the struggles of those before us inform the actions we take today." As students delved into research, Jason was invited to speak on a panel alongside local leaders, educators, and activists. The event drew a large audience, and as he stood before them, he could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. But he took a deep breath, reminding himself why he was there. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he began, his voice steady. "It takes dedication, community, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone who has ever felt marginalized or unsafe." The crowd responded with applause, and as he spoke, Jason noticed many of his classmates nodding in agreement. For the first time, he felt truly connected to the larger movement. He was not just a victim of injustice. He was a catalyst for change. Bridges and barriers. Despite the growing support, the road was not without its challenges. There were moments when Jason would receive hurtful comments on social media, and there were still whispers in the hallways that stung deeply. The divide in Westridge became more evident, and Jason knew that some people were still unwilling to accept the truth about systemic racism. One afternoon, while walking home from school with Naomi and Marcus, they encountered a group of students gathered outside a local diner. Some of them were holding signs that read "Back the Blue" and "Justice for All," with their expressions tense and defensive. Jason felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he realized that they were directly opposing the movement he had become a part of. "What do you want?" Jason called out, his voice steady but laced with frustration. One of the boys, a former friend named Caleb, stepped forward. "We want to support the police, man. They do a tough job, and you're just making it harder for them with all this noise." Naomi scoffed, crossing her arms. "You mean the noise of people demanding justice?" Caleb shrugged, his expression dismissive. "Yeah, but what about their side? You're painting them all with the same brush because of what happened to you." Jason took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. It's not about painting anyone with a broad brush. It's about holding those who are in power accountable. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that needs change. Caleb shook his head, clearly unconvinced. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding. People make mistakes. Jason felt a surge of frustration. That's the problem. These mistakes have consequences that people like me have to live with. It's not just a mistake. It's a pattern. The exchange continued, tension rising as both sides stood firm in their beliefs. The conversation was a reminder of the division within their community, and as they parted ways, Jason felt a weight on his chest. Not everyone understood or wanted to understand, and that was something he had to grapple with moving forward. Building a movement. Despite the challenges, Jason continued to find strength in the support of his friends and family. The local NAACP chapter became a central hub for organizing events, and they began to plan community workshops focused on educating residents about racial profiling, implicit bias, and the importance of allyship. One evening, as Jason sat at the dining room table with his parents, they discussed the upcoming workshops. Evelyn looked excited as she flipped through the materials. "These workshops are a great opportunity to educate our community," she said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We need to help people understand that change starts with awareness." "I agree," Jason added, feeling a sense of purpose swell within him. "If we can create a safe space for conversation, maybe we can break down some of those barriers." His father, Mark, nodded thoughtfully. "You know, the more people we can reach, the more we can challenge the misconceptions and stereotypes that exist in this town." As the weeks passed, Jason threw himself into organizing the workshops, reaching out to speakers and experts who could facilitate discussions. The events were set to take place at the local community center, and Jason felt a rush of anticipation as the date approached. On the day of the first workshop, the community center was filled with chairs and tables, adorned with informational pamphlets. Jason stood at the front of the room, nervously adjusting his notes as attendees trickled in. Among them were friends, family, and even some unfamiliar faces, people who had been touched by his story or were eager to learn more. The workshop began with a powerful keynote address from a local civil rights attorney who had dedicated her life to fighting against police misconduct. She spoke passionately about the importance of community engagement and the power of collective action. "Change doesn't come from the top down. It comes from the grassroots level," she emphasized. "It starts with each one of you. Your voices matter." As the workshop unfolded, participants broke into smaller discussion groups, allowing for open dialogue about their experiences and perspectives. Jason moved from group to group, listening intently as people shared their stories. It was eye-opening to hear firsthand accounts of how systemic racism had affected their lives. One woman, an elderly resident named Mrs. Johnson, shared her experience of being followed in stores simply because of the color of her skin. "I've lived here my whole life, and I've seen things change, but there's still so much work to be done," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Jason felt a deep sense of connection to her story. These workshops were not just about educating others. They were about healing and building a community that understood the importance of standing together against injustice. A new horizon. As the weeks turned into months, the movement gained traction. The workshops became a regular occurrence, drawing more participants each time. Conversations about race and justice became commonplace in the hallways of Westridge High School, and students began to form alliances to advocate for change within the school system. One afternoon, Jason and Naomi were sitting in the library, brainstorming ideas for a new project they wanted to undertake. "We should start a student-led group focused on social justice," Naomi suggested, her eyes shining with excitement. Jason nodded, feeling invigorated by the idea. "Yes, we could organize events, promote awareness, and even partner with the NAACP for outreach." As they sketched out their plans, Jason felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer just about his individual experience. It was about creating lasting change in the community and empowering his peers to speak up. The first meeting of the student-led group was held in the school auditorium, and the turnout exceeded Jason's expectations. Students from all grades showed up, eager to be part of the conversation and contribute to the movement. Jason stood before them, feeling a wave of pride wash over him. "I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today," he began. "We have the power to change our school culture and make it a place where everyone feels safe and respected. Together, we can be the voices that speak up against injustice." As he spoke, he could see the fire in the eyes of his classmates, a spark that had ignited within them as they realized their potential for change. This was the beginning of something new, a collective effort to foster understanding and compassion within their community. Part 5 Summary. In this chapter, Jason embraces his role as an activist and begins organizing workshops focused on racial profiling and social justice within his community. Despite facing resistance from some individuals, he remains committed to fostering understanding and dialogue. As the movement grows, Jason finds strength in the support of friends and family, and he witnesses the ripple effect of his actions as more people engage in conversations about race and injustice. Through community gatherings and student-led initiatives, Jason and his peers work together to create a more inclusive environment in Westridge, solidifying their commitment to the fight for justice. The path forward. As spring blossomed in Westridge, the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and a renewed sense of hope. The community had come together in ways Jason had never imagined, and the collective energy surrounding the movement seemed to grow with each passing day. But while the warmth of spring was evident, the battle for justice was far from over. There were still hurdles to overcome, and Jason felt a profound responsibility to lead the charge. A community united. The success of the workshops and the student-led initiative had laid the groundwork for deeper connections within the community. People from diverse backgrounds began to engage in meaningful conversations about their experiences and perspectives. Jason often reflected on how far they had come since the initial protests. The conversations that had once been filled with tension now fostered a spirit of collaboration and understanding. At the beginning of the new month, the local NAACP chapter hosted a town hall meeting to discuss plans for a community outreach program. Jason was invited to speak, and he felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. This was an opportunity to not only represent his own experiences, but to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. As he walked into the town hall, the room buzzed with energy. Community leaders, educators, and residents filled the chairs, and the air was thick with anticipation. Jason took a deep breath and approached the microphone. "Thank you all for coming together today," he began, his heart racing. This movement started with a moment of injustice, but it has grown into something much larger. We have an opportunity to create a space where everyone in our community feels safe, heard, and valued. The crowd listened intently as Jason outlined his vision for the outreach program, which would involve partnerships with local organizations to provide resources, workshops, and support for marginalized groups. He emphasized the importance of inclusivity and the need for ongoing dialogue to sustain the momentum they had built. As we move forward, we must remember that this is not just about one event or one individual. It's about building a future where we can all coexist in harmony, where our differences are celebrated, and where justice is a right, not a privilege, he concluded. The applause that followed felt like a wave of encouragement, and Jason felt his resolve solidify. He had a role to play, and he was ready to step into it. The challenges ahead. While the community seemed to be moving in a positive direction, Jason was acutely aware that not everyone was on board with the changes taking place. In the weeks following the town hall meeting, a small but vocal group began to push back against the movement. They organized their own meetings, voicing concerns about divisiveness and reverse racism. The rhetoric was hurtful, but Jason reminded himself that their resistance came from a place of fear and misunderstanding. One evening, while scrolling through social media, Jason stumbled upon a video of one of these meetings. The group was airing their grievances, framing the movement as an attack on law enforcement and a misguided attempt to undermine community values. Jason felt anger bubbling within him. How could they twist a fight for justice into something negative? In a moment of reflection, Jason realized that fighting fire with fire wouldn't lead to understanding. It would only deepen the divide. He turned to his parents, seeking their wisdom on how to navigate this challenge. "Mom, Dad, what do we do when people are so resistant to the change we're advocating for?" he asked, frustration evident in his voice. Evelyn sighed, her brow furrowed in thought. Sometimes the best way to respond to fear is with compassion. It's essential to listen and to understand where they're coming from, even if you don't agree with them. Mark nodded in agreement. You have to remember that change takes time, and it often comes with discomfort. If you can engage in dialogue, maybe you can help bridge that gap. With their advice in mind, Jason decided to reach out to the leaders of the opposing group. He proposed a public forum where both sides could share their perspectives in a respectful environment. To his surprise, they agreed, viewing it as an opportunity to present their case. A tenuous dialogue. The day of the public forum arrived, and Jason felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The auditorium was packed, with attendees from both sides of the movement eager to engage in conversation. Jason took a deep breath as he stepped onto the stage, the bright lights illuminating the sea of faces before him. "Thank you all for coming," he began, glancing at the audience. "This is an opportunity for us to listen and learn from each other. While we may not always agree, I believe we can find common ground if we approach this with open hearts and minds." The opposing group's leader, a man named Tom, stood next to Jason, his arms crossed defensively. "We want to clarify that we support the police," he said, his tone firm. "But we also believe in accountability. We think the movement is making it harder for them to do their jobs." Jason nodded, recognizing the importance of acknowledging their viewpoint. "I understand that many people feel that way, but it's crucial to recognize that the fight for justice doesn't diminish the hard work of our law enforcement officers. It's about creating a system that holds everyone accountable, including those in positions of power." The back and forth continued, with audience members posing questions and sharing their thoughts. It was a tense exchange, filled with moments of disagreement and discomfort. But amidst the tension, there were also moments of genuine connection, a shared understanding that everyone present desired a safer community. As the evening wore on, Jason felt a shift in the atmosphere. Some individuals from the opposing group began to express their concerns about racial profiling, admitting they had never considered how systemic issues could affect people's lives. This openness surprised Jason, and he seized the moment. "Let's talk about the statistics and the stories behind them," he said passionately. "It's essential to recognize that the issues we're discussing affect real people. We're not just numbers. We're human beings with dreams, families, and hopes for a better future." The dialogue continued, and as the night drew to a close, Jason felt a sense of accomplishment. While they hadn't resolved all their differences, they had taken a significant step toward understanding one another. As the audience dispersed, several individuals approached Jason, thanking him for facilitating the conversation. "Thank you for being willing to listen," one woman said, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I didn't realize how my perspective had been shaped by fear." Jason smiled, feeling a renewed sense of hope. Change was possible, even if it came in small steps. Empowerment through education. In the weeks that followed, the public forum became a catalyst for more discussions. Schools began to incorporate social justice education into their curricula, and Jason was invited to collaborate with teachers to create lesson plans that focused on empathy, understanding, and activism. During one session, Jason and Naomi worked together to design a workshop for younger students. They crafted interactive activities that encouraged kids to explore their identities and discuss the importance of respecting one another's differences. As they set up the classroom, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. "We're planting seeds for the future," he said, glancing at Naomi. "Exactly," she replied. a smile on her face. These kids will grow up knowing how to advocate for themselves and others. The workshop was a resounding success. The younger students engaged enthusiastically, participating in discussions and sharing their thoughts. Jason watched as their eyes lit up with understanding, and he felt a sense of fulfillment wash over him. This was what it meant to make a difference, a vision for the future. As summer approached, the community of Westridge continued to evolve. Jason was proud of the work they had accomplished together, but he knew there was still a long road ahead. The challenges of systemic racism and injustice wouldn't disappear overnight, but the movement had sparked a fire within the community that couldn't be extinguished. One evening, as Jason sat in his backyard reflecting on the journey, he thought about how far he had come. The experience of being wrongfully arrested had transformed him from a teenager navigating high school to an activist with a purpose. He had learned the importance of resilience, empathy, and the power of community. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Jason closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the day envelop him. He envisioned a future where everyone could coexist peacefully, where conversations about race and justice became part of everyday life. In that moment, he made a silent promise to himself. He would continue to fight for justice and equality, not just for himself, but for those who felt voiceless. He knew the journey would be challenging, but he felt ready to embrace it. A legacy of change. The culmination of Jason's journey was evident as Westridge prepared for its annual summer festival. This year, the theme was Unity in Diversity, a celebration of the community's commitment to inclusion and understanding. Jason and his friends worked tirelessly to organize activities that would educate attendees about social justice issues while promoting local artists and businesses. On the day of the festival, the park was alive with music, laughter, and the vibrant colors of various cultural displays. Booths lined the paths, showcasing artwork, food, and information about local organizations dedicated to promoting social change. Jason stood at the entrance, feeling a sense of pride swell within him as he watched families gather, enjoying the festivities. As the festival unfolded, Jason took to the stage to address the crowd. He spoke passionately about the importance of unity and the role each person played in creating a more just society. This festival is not just a celebration. It's a reminder of what we can achieve when we come together as a community, he said, his voice ringing out across the park. We have the power to create change, to uplift one another, and to stand against injustice. Together, we can build a brighter future for everyone. As the crowd erupted into applause, Jason felt a surge of hope. He looked out at the faces, young and old, diverse and unified, and knew they were all part of this journey together. Conclusion. The ongoing journey. As summer faded into autumn, Jason's commitment to activism only deepened. He became involved in regional efforts to address police reform, participating in meetings and collaborating with organizations that aimed to create policy changes. The journey had transformed him, allowing him to meet people from various walks of life, all committed to the same cause. Jason realized that while they had made significant strides in Westridge, the fight for justice was a lifelong endeavor. He embraced this realization, knowing that it was the conversations, the connections, and the collective efforts that would ultimately lead to lasting change. In his heart, Jason carried the lessons he had learned, the importance of resilience, the power of community, and the value of empathy. He understood that every individual has a role to play in the pursuit of justice and that their voices, when united, could create a symphony of change. As he walked through the familiar streets of Westridge, he felt a sense of belonging and purpose. He had turned his pain into a force for good, and he was determined to ensure that his story, and the stories of countless others, would resonate for years to come. And so, with every step he took, Jason knew he was not just walking forward. He was paving the way for a brighter future, a future where justice, equality, and love would flourish in the hearts of all.